Welcome back. The other day I received a comment on the survivalgardener.com blog, where I post every weekday, by Bruce the Bad. And he wrote me to ask why gardening in the Florida Panhandle was not working out. Help! Retired pre-pandemic in the Florida mountains, northern Walton County, elevation 300 plus feet, zone 8-ish. Pine and cedar are the old established trees, some small hardwood, and lots of yaupon holly, wild grapes, and poison ivy. Have been unable to establish a productive garden or food forest on our 5-acre hobby farm / homestead. Found your book this year and have started containerized gardens in 5, 10, and 20-gallon fabric grow bags, with a small greenhouse and 400 square foot tilled garden plot. Compost with chicken, goat, and horse. Have been raking up and burning the pine needles to reduce fire risk. Lemon trees died. Mulberry and plum trees look sickly. 6-inch tall fig trees are still in pots in the greenhouse to plant this spring. 3 of the 5 acres are goat pens, etc., etc. What am I doing wrong? Well, today, let's see if we can help. The first reason I see for Bruce's gardening being so difficult is his location. The Florida Panhandle and north central Florida, particularly towards the middle of the state, meaning on the ridge, far from the ocean or the Gulf, that is not the easiest place to garden. And there are a lot of great places in Florida to garden, as in very easy climates. Like South Florida, where I grew up, where it never froze and you could have mangoes and coconuts and pineapples in your backyard, no issue whatsoever. Or if you go further south, down into the Redlands, that area south of Miami and all that area right there is absolutely beautiful. It's like all the bounty of the Caribbean will grow there. It's more like gardening in Puerto Rico than it is gardening in the continental United States. And then if you were to say, be right near on the coast by Fort Myers or in that rich soil that's just a little south of Okeechobee, those are all pretty easy places. Now, even if the soil's not very good, the climate is amenable. The problem when you get into zone 8 and 9 Florida, particularly in the Panhandle, that's a zone 8 climate. And what this means is it's not moderate. It's too hot and miserable and humid and full of bugs during the summer for a lot of the crops that would grow further north, like peaches and plums and mulberries and a lot of other things. They have a lot of issues with late frosts knocking the blooms off. Not that you can't grow them, but that it's not as easy as it should be. The vacillating swings between 85 degrees one day and 25 degrees the next day, that is really tough, even on temperate plants that could normally handle the cold, because it swings, it goes up and down. And then of course when you get to the summer, it's 100 degrees. It's 100 degrees, it's just too hot. So the tropical stuff that could live up there and would do fine through that hot summer doesn't do well in the winter because it can plunge down into the teens. So you go from hitting the teens in the winter to being sometimes over 100 in the summer. That's not good for temperate, and it's not good for tropical. That is simply a difficult climate to garden in. The second issue that you're dealing with in North Florida gardening and in most of the state is that the soil is not always really soil. It can just be dirt. It can just be sand. If you get down into the Keys, it can just be limestone. That's not very good because, your garden plants, a lot of the stuff that you want to grow for food is not that well adapted to poor soil because over many generations, people have raised their garden plants to be weak, to raise a whole bunch of food in a wonderful, well-tended situation where you take the weeds away and you amend the soil and you put in manure and you till deeply for those weak little roots to reach what they need. He's telling me that he's got pines, yaupon hollies. These are indicators of acid, poor soil. When you buy a homestead, you really got to pay attention to the soil. It's not that it's impossible to grow when you start with poor soil. It's just that you are fighting against geology instead of going with it. For 2 years, we gardened in what I call the sand pit of death, and often the cursed sand pit of death. And that was this nasty, very acid grit with a little bit of pebbles in it, and the ground would actually get hard when it was dry, even though it was sandy. There were some chemical issues with it. It was very acid, very low in organic matter, and that is probably similar to the situation that Bruce is dealing with. And when you have that kind of low fertility, acid, often fast draining soil, gardening is simply an uphill proposition. So Florida Bullfrog, who's also on YouTube, he raises chickens, and he raises survival chickens. He has free-ranging birds living in the woods and in the swamps. He mentions that his soil is really poor in acid. He's in a similar location to Bruce in North Florida, and instead of relying on plants, he's actually relying on lots and lots of eggs and lots of chicken from scrappy free-range birds. He's got turkeys, he's got guineas, and he has got the chickens. And so, yeah, you can get animal food. A lot of the people that lived in Florida early on, they weren't really that into gardening. As a matter of fact, they knew that it was a very difficult place to garden, and so they ran cattle, or they had pigs, or they had scrappy game fowl chickens that could survive all of the predators and pick out a living for themselves in these poor conditions. When you try to garden on it, it's difficult. So let's talk about what Bruce can do, or any of you that are living in similar conditions, to improve and actually garden on this soil. Let's say you don't want to just live off of animal products. There's nothing wrong with doing that. You could feed all that poor quality material to the animals and then eat the animals, or milk the animals, or get eggs from the animals, but maybe you just really want to garden. I always want to garden. I like having fresh vegetables. I like being able to raise a lot of different crops and trees, and I love my food forest system. So living without gardening for me is just basically impossible, and I'm sure a lot of you watching this channel feel the same way. So what can you do? Let's say you've got this weird climate where it swings way up and it swings way down, and then you have poor soil. Well, the first thing to do is to work on that soil. And often the first thing these acid, high rainfall situations need is lime. Lots and lots of lime. Now, I'm not talking about quick-acting lime or any of these special limes. I'm just talking about that pulverized limestone that you could go down to your local co-op or farmer's supply store. Where we are here, you can actually just go to some of these places and they will give you a big trailer that you rent with the lime, and you go and spread the lime around and throw it all over your field, and then come back and you can load it up again and throw it all around. It's a lime buggy. That's what they call it. And that lime will make the chemical reactions in the soil work better for your more tender plants. So it actually loosens the soil significantly as it raises the pH. It also makes the plants have a better ability to take out the nutrients they need. So there are some places in Florida that are absolutely full of lime already, with a pH in the 7s or even hitting 8, and you don't need to add any lime. But in a lot of these situations, particularly where you see pines, I have seen really bad, patchy pine land transformed into really beautiful, rich pasture by a woman that limed repeatedly, limed and limed and limed, and got that bahia grass growing in there, and now has beautiful pasture for her animals. And part of that is just manipulating that pH, but another part of it that people may miss, besides the pH, is that calcium deficiencies make everything much worse for your plants. So you add that calcium in there, and it's like the staves of a barrel. Whichever stave is the lowest is where the water is going to leak out. So if you're not getting full capacity, you're missing something, and calcium is often what you're missing in those acid soils. You throw it on there, and a lot of the plants that used to be a problem, like those really rambly dewberries that tear up your feet, and the centipede grass that invades and makes a carpet, a lot of those things start to disappear, and the species that you would rather have will start to increase. Just don't lime around your blueberries, because they don't generally like that very much. So the first thing I would do is lime, and then add biochar as a possibility. You could see what we did in the sandpit of death. We made productive grocery row gardens through much work, but we added lime, we added alfalfa pellets to the soil to put in some spongy organic matter. We added some of our own cow manure from the fields. We added biochar. We mulched heavily with whatever we could get, and we planted cover crops, particularly southern peas. And during the winter, we planted winter ryegrass and clover to put life into the soil, pump those sugars in there, keep those carbon pathways moving, keep it loose, keep it alive, stop the erosion. And that, along with the lime and everything else, started to make something that looked like soil, even though our area, according to the USDA soil surveys, was not suitable for agriculture. It was just pine land. You could have a pine forest and cut it down occasionally, and you could get away with blueberries, but it was not good for gardening whatsoever. But if you're working on a backyard scale, you can do this a bit at a time, and you can actually start to transform it. You may have to lime it again in a couple of years, but you don't really have to worry that much about over-liming if you're using limestone. You can just throw a ton of it on there, or 2 tons of it on there, and see what happens. And usually within a year or so, you start to see results. And then you'll see very quick results from adding lots of compost and wood chips. That makes a very big difference. My next suggestion after the soil is to plant the plants that actually live well in this climate. It is a difficult climate, and a lot of things that you try are not going to do all that well. Like, for example, the lemon tree that died, that's because the Meyer lemon, which is a commonly sold variety around here, it's only good down into the 20s. But we hit down into the teens this last winter in December after it being 80-something degrees. That kills them. They die. They just can't take it unless you have a protected location or you keep it in a pot. I have lemons behind me over here that are in big pots because I didn't have a protected location that I could just put them in. So the lemons, you know, and some other things are just not particularly suited. They would have done better a little further south. They would do worse a little bit further north, but they're in a so-so area where you are. Plant stuff that likes the climate. So if you want to grow a lot of food, plant sweet potatoes, okra, black-eyed peas, true yams, turnips and turnip greens. These all do well and are easy to grow. They're traditional southern staples, and that is for a reason. So you get the soil first, then you get the plants going. Then you have success. And you just double down on the stuff that grows really well for you. And also, make friends with whoever around you has a garden. Go look around your neighborhood, go drive around and look for anybody in the spring that's planting a garden and say, have you had any luck? How's it going? Anything that's really worked well for you. That's where you get a lot of really close on-the-ground information that's better than anybody on YouTube can share with you. Finally, there's one other problem that you might be having. You talk about how the mulberry looks really bad and the plum looks really bad and nothing really wants to grow, but that you're making compost from manure. Remember that there are long-term persistent herbicides that are commonly used in hay in the state of Florida, and in a lot of the South, and in a lot of the country. Aminopyralids are one of the main culprits. What happens is, hayfield gets sprayed, the animal eats that hay, the animal makes manure, it passes through the digestive system, you can compost that manure, 6 months later, a year later, you could put it on your garden and it will kill all the broadleaf plants in your garden or severely damage them. It'll also damage your trees. We damaged a lot of trees when we got hit with this stuff. You can go see my other videos on it. But that's something, if you are composting manure and adding it and you don't know the pedigree of that manure, if it has not been very carefully vetted, like you grew the hay or the forage, the animals ate that, you know nothing was sprayed, or you absolutely know that the farmer that you bought the hay from does not spray anything, and then you have to have a lot of trust, and sometimes that trust is not well placed. So just keep that in mind, that that manure can totally destroy your garden, and that could be a problem as well, on top of the climate and the poor soil. So to wrap up, my 3 points: watch out for the bad manure. Grow what grows according to your climate. Grow what traditionally grew in your area and is easy to raise if you don't want to just live on animals. And build that soil up as best as you can. And if the soil is still sandy and patchy and whatever, you can use something like Dave's Fetid Swamp Water or manure teas and other things to foliar feed, which makes up for the poor soil underneath, such as it is. I don't even like to call it soil. When people say, why don't you call that soil? I say, no, that's dirt. That's not soil, that's just dirt. And North Florida's full of dirt, but you can make it into soil if you work at it. If you want to learn more about Florida gardening, I have multiple books on the state. It is a big state and there's a lot to learn about. Totally Crazy Easy Florida Gardening is my best-selling category bestseller on Amazon repeatedly. Totally Crazy Easy Florida Gardening. That points you in the right direction. This is how you will have success in your first year growing food in Florida, period. Then there is Florida Survival Gardening, which is more on intensive food production. What do you do if the grid goes down? What do you do if you really need food? What really will produce in the state of Florida? That's Florida Survival Gardening. And ignore Amazon where it says that there is a newer version of Florida Survival Gardening. That is not true. There is only one book called Florida Survival Gardening, and the next book, Create Your Own Florida Food Forest, is not a new edition. For some reason, I can't get them to take that off, but Florida Survival Gardening is a very popular book. A lot of information for very serious food growing in Florida. And then Create Your Own Florida Food Forest, the revised, expanded, gigantic second edition, is all about creating food forests in Florida with lots of species profiles and tons of illustrations from over 54 different artists. It's a beautiful book. It is the main food forest guide to Florida. It would also work along lower Alabama, Louisiana, portions of Texas, etc. in that 8, 9, 10, 11 growing zone. And then finally, if you're in South Florida, the South Florida Gardening Survival Guide will help you there, especially with the iguanas that want to eat everything. So thanks for joining me. If you have any questions or anything, drop them below, and you can always come over to the blog where I post every weekday. This was originally a blog post over there, and I expanded it out into a video. You can leave comments. I post every weekday, and that is thesurvivalgardener.com. Thanks for joining me. Have fun wherever you're gardening, and until next time, may your thumbs always be green.